We say in our work, this is what healing looks like, and it's called a somatic discharge. And what also you're describing is something called the reconsolidation of memory.
When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you're ready to transform your life and claim the potential inside of you, you're in the right place. Welcome back to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. As an integrative specialist and breathwork facilitator, I'm invested in making the dynamic landscape of personal evolution accessible. My goal is to inspire you to take action for yourself. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn simple methods you can use to transform your life and share the stories of practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a 5-star review. It's an easy, free way to support the show and help more people discover these simple, life-changing practices. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you share it with a friend. Like Ram Dass said, we're just walking each other home. And my mission is that this podcast can be a part of that path. Welcome back to the Vital Point podcast. This is the first full episode of 2024. If you've been following on YouTube, you know I've been doing the integrative journals. So far, those are YouTube only, but I'll be getting them into the audio platforms soon. But thanks for bearing with me through the holiday break. And there's been some ups and downs that have put some delays into the podcast production schedule. And I'm happy to be back at it and bringing you a very special, amazing episode that in the spirit of season 8 is someone that I met at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference. I'm a huge fan of his book, Psychedelic Cannabis. This one is Therapeutic Methods and Unique Blends to Treat Trauma and Transform Consciousness. He's also the author of Psychedelic Cannabis, Breaking the Gate. My guest on this episode is none other than Daniel McQueen. Daniel is a psychedelic specialist, psychedelic therapy educator, activist, as well as the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness, which was one of the first legal psychedelic plant medicine centers in the United States. Daniel specializes in using cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy and ketamine-assisted psychedelic therapy. Since Colorado legalized natural psychedelics in 2022 for personal use, Daniel leads his team in providing psilocybin and DMT support services through his nonprofit, the Medicinal Mindfulness Foundation, and is spearheading an effort to make extended state DMT experiences accessible through his DMTX program. Daniel has significant experience guiding clients with severe mental health struggles, such as PTSD, as well as growth-oriented experiences that support creative, problem-solving, personal growth, and spiritual exploration. Daniel holds a master's degree in transpersonal counseling psychology from Naropa University and has over 20 years of experience as a psychedelic professional. He is the lead trainer in the Center's Psychedelic Therapy training program, the Psychedelic Sitter School. His work through the Psychedelic Sitter School and with Psychedelic Cannabis has created an internationally recognized movement of practitioners across the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Australia, and Israel. You know, as a breathwork facilitator myself and someone that has worked with cannabis in a ceremonial container, as well as blending cannabis and breathwork together, I really have enjoyed his book. It's been very inspirational to me. I've definitely taken pieces of it and integrated it into my own practice and my own work with clients. And so I was just super excited to fanboy out on this one, you know. Honestly, the conversation did not disappoint. You know, we talk about psychedelic cannabis, how Daniel got involved with using it in that set and setting. We really dive into using cannabis as a psychedelic medicine rather than as a recreational experience, and talk about some of the most important things to intentional psychedelic work: setting, intention, and dosage. And the conversation goes in a neat direction as far as some of the benefits for healing trauma with working with cannabis, and how they're how it's similar to MDMA in terms of the healing potential as far as the somatic discharge and, kind of reorganization that can happen as a result of these intentional sessions. And then we get into the process of holding space, things that you should be looking for and asking when you're looking for a sitter or a guide, as well as things to consider if you are considering going into work in psychedelic service and holding space yourself. And, this is something that was really on my mind during the conference and sort of in the aftermath. So you might notice that this season, there's a lot of that question coming up is, asking the guests, why do you think it is that people come out of these peak experiences or out of a strong ceremony and feel called to work with the medicine themselves? So without further ado, please enjoy this episode with Daniel McQueen. Here, it was a pleasure running into you at the MAPS conference recently, and so grateful that we were able to connect here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to seeing you. Good seeing you again in this space. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I was encouraged to set out a list of intentions for people that I wanted to connect with and to meet at the conference. And your name was definitely one of them. We've got the Psychedelic Cannabis book here. You can
great.
see I've got a few earmarks in there because it's really been a pretty special book for me and my work in the last couple of years. So I think maybe a great place to begin is just like when was the first time that you started to consider working with cannabis in like a more of a ceremonial and psychedelic context?
Yeah, I had already experienced cannabis as a psychedelic, but like many people, it felt still elusive and not possible. Like a lot of us have this mindset that cannabis isn't a psychedelic. Like we were talking about, it's more of a recreational drug. So I had that same mindset, even though I had had a few psychedelic experiences with cannabis, or I'd always used cannabis in conjunction with other psychedelics, right? It's just part of how we practice sometimes. But after I graduated from Naropa, I got my master's in transpersonal counseling, and I wanted to be a psychedelic guide. I was already practicing in a lot of ways, but I wanted it to be in legal settings. And a friend of mine suggested that we consider working with cannabis as a psychedelic. And so all we did was we started to experiment by just creating similar protocols that we would use in group settings with psychedelic medicines or individual settings with psychedelic medicines. We just replaced the medicine with special blends of cannabis just to see what would happen. And so that was right when cannabis became legal here in Colorado in 2024. That was what precipitated the conversation. And we did a few practice runs, and people were completely blown away by the experience. Like it was beyond obvious that it could be used as a tool right away. And so I just started to experiment with it, through regular we called them conscious cannabis circles at the time, regular psychedelic experiences with using special blends of cannabis. And that led to creating this whole program around the work and precipitated working with psilocybin and ketamine in our clinic. So it's been an incredible tool. It's just so hard to describe how potent it is for people who haven't experienced it in that way yet.
Yeah, and such an important point that you bring up there, and that one of the main things that I gravitated towards in the book, as far as the importance of the container and the set and setting that you're bringing it into. And it's funny because sort of my partner is, we both do very similar things for a living, and are both fairly involved in working with plant medicines and ceremony. And a sort of a debate that we often have, or that she's brought up several times, is do you think you could have an alcohol ceremony? And
Mm,
I'm always like, no, no, no. And
mm,
but to her point, it's like, well, what if you did put it in to the right set and setting and
mm,
treated it as a ceremony? Do you think that it would change kind of
mm,
the, you know, and I think that's
mm,
somewhat to what you're speaking to, right? With
mm.
cannabis, of the container that the medicine is placed into, and treating it with the reverence of a medicine does change somewhat of the outcome
Sure.
that someone can get from it.
Hmm. Yeah, just the intention as treating cannabis as a psychedelic makes it more psychedelic.
Mm.
So there is an intentionality aspect, right? The mindset aspect. And then there are certain strategies and techniques working with cannabis that are required that are a little different than working with other psychedelic medicines. Cannabis provides a sense of agency, like you keep your ego intact with cannabis. So, in a lot of ways, you have to choose to go into the psychedelic of experience with cannabis. Whereas if you took a handful of mushrooms, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have a trip, right?
Right.
So there's certain strategies to help a person choose to go into the experience. I've actually thought about that question too, about like some sort of alcohol ceremony, and because of the nature of my work with cannabis. And one, I think cannabis by definition is considered an hallucinogen in scientific literature, right? So an
Mhm.
hallucinogen is another way scientifically to say psychedelic, whereas alcohol is technically a depressant, right? So in the amount you would have to take with alcohol to reach an altered state would get you pretty drunk. Whereas cannabis, you can stay very lucid and not drunk feeling in these spaces. So I think those are some significant differences. I think you could have a meaningful experience, but it wouldn't be something I would recommend doing on the
Right.
regular. Cannabis doesn't kill people like alcohol does, with long term chronic use. The abuse potential of cannabis is significantly reduced from alcohol, compared to alcohol. So I think that, so what we're doing is like not just saying cannabis is a recreational drug like alcohol that can be used for ceremony. What we're saying instead is that cannabis is a ceremonial tool and a psychedelic that has been used recreationally and has been kind of degraded in our culture as a recreational drug when it's actually more akin to a psychedelic, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and that also quality makes a difference, right? So if you're trying to have a psychedelic cannabis experience on brickweed that's like full of pesticides and has CBD and low THC content, you're just not going to get there in comparison to like these organic, psychedelic, high potency blends that we're making now because of legalization. So I think it's a valid point, but I think there's like cost involved in using certain substances in ceremony that we would try to avoid, right? As harm reduction advocates.
Mhm. Um, could you speak a little bit more to some of those specific strategies that you mentioned
That
to, create that psychedelic container?
Yeah, yeah. One is the blend itself. You want to have a high potency blend of a third indica, a third sativa, and a third hybrid strains. And what that does is what we call it creates like a full spectrum psychedelic cannabis experience. So you get the full, the active imagination and extreme ideation of the sativa, but you also get the body relaxation of the indica. Um, and then the hybrids are more of a heart opening experience, right? So imagine combining that into one full experience. So I think the blend does make a difference, even though you can have full experiences with just your favorite strain. The other thing is to pay attention to dosing, right? And like for me, I'm a semi-regular consumer of this medicine, so my tolerance might be different for someone who never smokes at all. So, but somebody who never smokes at all doesn't want to take 10 hits, right? It might be too much for them. So knowing your dose and kind of pushing your edges of what your comfort zone is with this medicine. It is dose dependent, right? So you want to make sure you're getting enough medicine in you. And then the last piece is like the setting of the experience and certain physical postures. So setting it up as an intentional journey experience with music and the right aesthetic is important. And then the last piece is posture. And when you sit up with cannabis, you stay lucid and present, right? Like you just get real high if you take a good amount. But if you lay down and turn inward and fully relax into the experience, you don't have to hold your body up. Turn towards like some really simple breathing practices. People pretty quickly go into psychedelic level states with the medicine. And so this is where that agency comes in. So if I'm having a really big experience that I need to take a break from the cannabis experience, I can just sit up. Or if I need to use the restroom, I can just sit up and I will step out of that full psychedelic state. It's like cannabis allows you to hit the pause button on a psychedelic trip, which is a little different than, I mean, a lot different than these other medicines, right? And then if I want to go back inward, you know, I'm complete with my break, I just have to lay back down again. I don't even have to smoke more medicine, and I'll start to reorient to more of an inner psychedelic experience. So this is where this agency comes in. The more you move around, the less psychedelic it is. The more you hold still gently and relax into the experience, the deeper it goes. So that's one of the primary trait differences between cannabis and, say, you know, a couple of hits of acid, or, you know, 5-gram mushroom trip, or smoking DMT. You keep this sense of agency about you, and keep your ego more intact, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, it's okay to have a good ego function in these spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's coming up for me around that, you know, and you mentioned it, is the self agency and willingness to open, you know, which in more of like a holotropic sort of vernacular might be referred to as surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as a breathwork facilitator myself, oftentimes I am comparing it versus, like, say, a strong mushroom experience or an ayahuasca experience. There's that meme that I'm awful fond of like a person standing on the edge of a cliff, and there's this big hand about to flick them off, and the hand says ayahuasca, and then there's like a hand underneath the cliff about to, you know, catch them that also says ayahuasca. And I said, you know, just think about going off of like a high dive or something like that, where you start to feel that anxiety of jumping. And
Mm-hmm.
when you're working with a strong, you know, medicine like ayahuasca or mushrooms, you don't really have a choice. Once you've ingested that hand is shoving you off the cliff, whether you
Mm-hmm.
want to or not. Whereas with breath
Mm-hmm.
work, and I think what you're describing with cannabis as well, it's really more of that self determination that you have to
Mm-hmm.
let yourself open fully to the experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so with breath work, right, like the choices are slowing your breath down or just choosing not to breathe, right? It takes effort to step into that space. It's like a workout in some ways. With
Yeah.
cannabis, like there is still that allyship, similar to the breath, but imagine the cannabis supports the experience in a way that's similar to the breath work. And instead of flicking you off the edge of the cliff, it more coaxes you off. It more invites you gently to take the plunge, you know, in a good way, but you still have that choice to do so. Generally speaking, you know, we do work with it in clinical settings, and people with severe trauma, right? Like sometimes it will definitely activate a healing process that requires them to engage more like other psychedelics. But even
Mm-hmm.
there, people indicate that it still feels like they have more agency and more of an emotional support like MDMA provides, right? As opposed to like a psilocybin journey, which just kind of flings you into it.
Right.
It's very supportive, and so cannabis is also an empathogen like MDMA. So
Mm.
I've really uh, uh, learned to really appreciate the therapeutic qualities because it helps you retain your agency and provides like this emotional support. Even if it's really hard, it still feels mostly okay, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it also sounds like there's an aspect of titration that can be really
Mm-hmm.
helpful for people. It's like there's so many, we were talking about this before we hit record, like there's so many people now because of the changing legal and decriminal status of psychedelic medicines that's occurring, that are now expressing interest in the validity of these medicines that, you know, perhaps other
Mm-hmm.
folks like that have been working with it for years already knew. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not necessarily, you don't have to just jump into the deep end. Like you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to go for the most extreme experience that you can. I think there is a value for some
Mm-hmm.
people of slowly titrating into it and having these, um, sort of exploratory experiences, because
Mm-hmm.
being able to fully let go is kind of a skill in itself.
Yeah,
It's something that we learn and we get better at,
right,
as we come up against those resistances and against that, like the ego trying to kind of hang
right,
on sometimes.
right. Or, we all have these inner semi-autonomous defenses too, right? So
Yeah.
if somebody's never done a medicine before, it can be really scary as hell,
Right.
and we see this in our clinic, and people who are really dead set on working with only psilocybin, we see a certain percentage of them who struggle with anxiety or control, have a really hard time in those like pre-breakthrough spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do is really promote cannabis as a stepping stone into working with psilocybin, because one, so it's as potent as psilocybin. Like people, some of them are even describing, like in the clinic now, their cannabis trips is even more intense than their psilocybin journeys, but they have that sense of agency intact, right? And so they're able to get to know that space better without it evoking extreme anxiety. And what we're also finding is some of that initial healing can take place with the cannabis, which allows for the transition into psilocybin work, making it gentler, right? Like, okay, I know this place, and even though I'm in a rocket ship, I at least am familiar with the sensations, and I'll have a little more agency in letting go or surrendering into the mushroom experience. And so we're actively seeing this phenomenon in our center right now. Not everybody takes us up on working with cannabis first, and we can see their struggles, right?
Mm.
Which is fascinating. It was not out of the possibility, but it was surprising in a way to like see it so explicitly in the work we do.
Yeah, I think even before I picked up the book, we had watched some sort of video that you guys put together, just kind of showing the process, and especially sort of the trauma release and like
Mm-hmm.
shaking, that went
Mm-hmm.
along with working with cannabis sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
that was, it was so validating for me to watch that, because as I've begun to work more, and this is, we're going back a few years now, but like when I started to work more intentionally with, um, like ayahuasca and mushrooms, there was a period where I stopped using recreational cannabis. And then when I
Mm-hmm.
came back to it, it was so potent and
Mm-hmm.
so like much more intense. And there were a few times where one of the first things that would happen was, like, I remember this one time, like I had just smoked. I was really just completely overwhelmed by what was happening. And I had this real distinct memory of something that happened to me as a teenager come up. And then I started to shake.
Yeah.
And rather than going away from it or being like, what the hell is happening?
Mm-hmm.
I laid down on the floor and just surrendered to it and like let it just move through me.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of things that came out of that. The first one was remembering that I used to do the same thing as a kid just thinking I had like a stupid human trick or something that I knew how to do. Like I had no idea that as a child I had developed this sort of like trauma coping,
Mm-hmm.
mechanism. But then
Uh,
really like leaning into that and being
yeah.
like, oh wait, this is a resource. And then
Yeah.
when I watched your guys' video, it was so affirming and validating, and
Mm-hmm.
something that I share now in my work of like, hey, like if this
Mm-hmm.
starts to happen, let it happen, like
Yeah.
go with it. It's
Yeah.
not something to be afraid of.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, the right on, man. So this is what the human body does, like the animal human body does to discharge real trauma. So it's not just coping; it's actually,
Yeah.
we say in our work, this is what healing looks like,
Right.
and it's called a somatic discharge. And what also you're describing is something called the reconsolidation of memory, which is common in MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And there's a neurology to it, but basically difficult experiences get stuck in our brain in the wrong place. And what MDMA does and what cannabis also does is it softens the amygdala so that those memories can be reprocessed through our frontal cortex and awareness so that they can be put in the right place. And that's called the reconsolidation of memory. And so cannabis does this too, is that it amplifies our access to previous memories that were not properly processed. They're all like just right there about to pop, right? And when they do pop, that's called a flashback or post-traumatic stress episode, right? But in these containers, it's done in a way that allows for a healing process. And so that's what MDMA and cannabis does specifically. And then cannabis takes it a step further. So a lot of people will shake and tremble on MDMA, but what cannabis is doing is engaging the endocannabinoid system through all the tissue in our body and relaxing it just a little bit more. And that allows for this somatic shaking discharge to leave the body in a supported way. And so what we see with people working with, when we work with people with severe PTSD, they're shaking and they're having memories flooding through them as they're engaging it with agency in the experience itself. And at a certain point, we get through a lot of that, right? Like there's only so much we hold as human beings. And so eventually the shaking becomes less and less of a process because you just don't need to do it as much. But imagine like not having any context for what you experience. You just were smoking pot with friends, and then all of a
Right.
sudden that shit happened. Like
Mm-hmm.
that can be really scary for folks. But in
Yeah.
the right container, this is what we celebrate as a healing process.
Yeah. Yeah. I've worked with cannabis, recreationally for years and years. My partner is fairly new, and
Mm-hmm.
it one one of the first experiences that we had together was pretty close after watching that video of yours, and it, basically exactly what you're describing ended up happening. Like literally, she looked at me and she said, something's wrong. I need you to call 911. And I was like,
Uh,
I'm here with you. Like, don't
uh,
like, this is natural. And
mm-hmm.
within a few minutes of her, just like me kind of being there with her and like, okay, just breathe, just like let it happen. And she started to shake,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what one of the things that we've talked about in since then is how both of us have experienced trauma in the medicine space, that we've had to like work through and process since. But there was a marked difference. Like there's no trauma around that experience for her.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it was really challenging, right? Like
Yeah.
she literally wanted me to call the ambulance for
Yeah.
her,
Yeah.
and so to be able to like actually have seen that full cycle to completion
Mm-hmm.
and walk away with a positive experience of it.
She felt better from it.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it was like,
Yeah.
just kind of goes to show what you're saying in terms of like
Yeah.
the healing potential of cannabis with the right set and setting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so you're familiar with breath work and Groff's work, right? So
Hmm.
one of what he says is a symptom is something halfway out, right? And
Yeah.
so that's what's happening is that whatever that was suppressed and stored in the body because we just didn't know what to do with it at the time finally creates this it like the cannabis creates just this opening for it to complete whatever process it needed to complete. And so it's actually the opposite of trauma. It's like the resolution of trauma, but
Right.
because it's a symptom halfway out, whatever the injury was, it looks like you're re-experiencing it,
Yep.
right? And so that's what makes it scary. But with MDMA again, or again with cannabis as a kind of a plant-based and pathogen, it provides this extra layer of support to allow you to be okay enough to engage it fully. And so that's how cannabis is a primary ally as a healer. It does something in addition to like just breath work would do or something, right? There's an allyship in that space with the medicine. So that's good. Unfortunately that, like there's nothing the paramedics would have been able to do in that
Right.
situation, like but we get, people call 911 because they've taken too much of an edible all the time because
Sure.
it's scary as hell. They think they're just going to get really high or
Yeah.
intoxicated, and what they do is they're tripping and
I I had that
and
experience
getting sick.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, like I had been completely sober for 7 years, and somebody gave me a brownie that they made, and it was
Yeah.
tiny. I mean, it was like, and I, ate it and literally had this experience where for a few hours I was convinced that they had put some sort of LSD or
Mm-hmm.
something else in it because I was having such a powerful experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
I can see how people kind of go with that fearful
Yeah.
response.
Well, imagine taking twice that amount of brownie if you had like done what most people do. It's like an hour later. It's like I'm not really feeling it. I'll just take another one, and then
Right,
that's when
right.
people get really sick. But it can be as potent as LSD.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you're kind of speaking to there is the interoception, right? Like it's the way I think that's
Mm-hmm.
it's what's been alive in my work a lot lately is like it's not just being able to feel the feelings that are coming up in the body, it's being able to separate and decouple the feeling from the meaning that the
Mm-hmm.
mind is like automatically assigning to it based on past
Mm-hmm.
experiences. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's when traumatic things are coming up. Of course there's this reaction in the body of like, no, this isn't safe, I don't want
Right.
to experience this again.
Right.
And so I appreciate what you're sharing in terms of the cannabis or the MDMA kind of helping to soften
Yeah.
those feelings and make them more accessible.
Yeah. And having a guide in the room really helps in those moments. I think that's really where a guide is one of the most essential places is to support someone who's hits an edge that's really hard, right?
Mm,
Because we can help soften and normalize, right? Normalize. I understand you're struggling right now, but this is what healing looks like, and to have confidence in that, and
yeah.
support with techniques that can help them stay with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that I think that's a great sort of segue there. What are some of those techniques that a guide could help somebody with in terms of psychedelic assisted therapy and support?
Yeah, right. Well, for me, I developed a protocol like, through our training program called mindfulness based psychedelic therapy, and that was just to give it a name of what we were doing. And because it's mindfulness based, one of the things we speak to is the presence of the guide is really one of the most important aspects of being a guide, right? And a lot of interventions are silent just by staying calm in a big process and staying well regulated in your own nervous system. Gives the client permission to stay with their experience more, right? If a client were having a big experience and the guide were freaked out, it would indicate that the space isn't safe and would then the client would start automatically shutting down their process, right? So we teach a lot of practices around staying self-regulated, through breath work and also through our own mindfulness practices of our own self-awareness. So that's the primary like space that we work from, right? This inner locus of control. And then within that space, one, just like making sure the person's taking the right amount, making sure they're comfortable and feel safe, making sure they're, like if they need help going to the bathroom, just like a gentle act of service, of kindness. That really goes a long way, because a lot of people have never experienced this level of just simple human kindness before. And then the last piece would be the intervention. So some would be, like you mentioned, titrating, helping someone stay with something and then softly take a break from it, go return to it, softly take a break from it, right? So titrating, reminding them to breathe, because the breath is our greatest ally and we sometimes forget about it. And then there's like maybe experiments. We're like from Gestalt, we talk about like, hey, you want to try something on? Like, I see you're struggling with this piece. I might have a strategy for that. Would you like to explore that with me? And a lot of times people are very open to suggestions like that, So I think it's a combination of presence and skillful interventions, but only when they're required to support someone who's kind of stuck, right?
Yeah, such an important point there, right? That we're ultimately there primarily or at least first, I should say, to hold the space.
Yeah. Call it like being a second nervous system. Yeah.
Ooh, I love
Just help
that.
run the energy moving through. Like we just take on a little bit of the psychic charge, so to speak. So, stay with it, help people just stay with something that would otherwise be overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. So for people that are like wanting to have these experiences, what are some questions that they could ask to a potential sitter or guide? Or what are some things that they could consider when making that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's a wide range of people that all use the title guide, right?
Right.
From the person who has been deeply inspired to do this work after a few sessions and starts giving the medicine to friends and sitting for them with no training, all the way to like really advanced practitioners with either clinical or medical or religious trainings, right? And so I think it's important to just name that not all guides are the same, and that it's okay to ask them pointed questions like, tell me about your practice, tell me about your training, tell me about your experience, tell me about your work with this particular medicine. And if somebody says, yeah, the medicine taught me how to do it and I was guided to this work, it's okay to ask about, well, okay, great. Well, but tell me more about your training and your experience, right? Like spirit, like we all have heard the calling for those of us who are guides. But some of us have gotten more training and have more experience than others. And so I think that's going to be important. And now this used to all be underground, and there would be a stigma of possibly being outed in certain experiences because of legality and things. And so sometimes that would hide a problematic behavior in certain communities. And I think as legalization gets broader and broader, that stigma is going to go away more and more. And so there's just going to be like an underlying accountability mechanism within our community of, just like community accountability. So that would be the last question I would have is like for a guide. Okay, who holds you accountable with your practice? Are you part of? They're underground practitioners that are part of councils of practitioners. Do they have something like that? If they're a licensed practitioner, is there a board, or are they part of a new psychedelic association? Like, I think personal accountability in oversight is going to be one of the new areas that I'm excited to see happen in our movement.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It is, I agree, very important. And something like, again, that my partner has brought up to me several times, from her experience as a therapist, and she's like, there's no boards, there's no
Mm.
ethics committee, there's none of these frameworks that we have in the therapeutic
Right.
setting. And it's that we need that, and we
Yeah.
obviously see some of the maybe misuses of power and
Mm.
inappropriateness. There's been several stories,
Sure.
sort of high
Yeah.
profile stories
Yeah.
recently. And so yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that point up.
Yeah. Yeah, just to follow up with that, like, so we created our own code of conduct. We've been doing this legally with cannabis because we've been working with cannabis as a plant medicine. We bumped up against all these edges like way before a lot of people have. So we had to develop our own code of conduct because there wasn't any. And then I created through our nonprofit an accountability mechanism and ways for people to stay involved in that way. Um, and so we created it for ourselves. It's like contractually legally binding to ensure that everybody is in compliance with it. But in the last year, especially with Oregon coming online and Colorado, there are now boards in certain states that will be having oversight.
Yeah.
They've started to build their own code of ethics, which has been great. And then there's also new like national professional associations that are starting to come online. And so there's been a lot of movement in this area within just the last 6 months to a year. It's brand new. So
Yeah, we're definitely on entering a new era, it seems.
mm,
And I for one welcome it. I often recommend people read The Ethics of Caring by Kylie Taylor, because
yeah,
here's
that's
this
a good
book
one.
that's
Mm,
specifically designed for the ethics of working with people in expanded
yeah,
states of consciousness. And it's
yeah,
important to acknowledge the special circumstances that might come up around that. So I
mm,
love hearing that you guys have
yeah.
your own code of conduct, and that you're um, bringing that aspect of accountability and responsibility into the work.
Yeah, it seemed kind of like I wanted to like, so I don't want people just to trust me. I wanted to have be held to the same accountability as the people in our program, right? It actually helps me knowing that I'm being held accountable, right? And so there's just an oversight mechanism that really, we talk about like what differentiates the guides, and one of the primary ones is there any community oversight, or are they just on their own? There's no telling what the spirits have told them is appropriate, because there might be a clear channel, but sometimes those messages get filtered through certain mental health struggles and other things, and we can assess for that. This isn't like um, a mystery. Like, you can actually assess for right conduct pretty easily, right? Um,
Mm.
but they have to be set up in a way to have have that accountability, to like choose to be in that space.
Yeah. This has been a question I've been asking a lot on the podcast lately, because it's just something that I'm curious about.
Yeah.
Why do you think that so many people after early peak experiences have that similar message of, I should work with the medicine,
Mm,
or the medicine told me to be more involved, or
yeah.
they want to get more involved in facilitation and holding space?
Yeah. I think it's just a natural response to one of the most profound experiences a person can have. And so they're just coming off of like the most profound experience they've ever had. Um, and it's appropriate to want to share that, right? Now, what happens though is, because generally speaking, if somebody's like really new to their personal process, right, or I want to be real polite, right? Like, you don't have to
Uh-huh.
be messed up or mentally unwell to think that you can be a guide, right? Like,
Right.
we all have that inner capacity. Where,
Mm-hmm.
where people get a little confused is like thinking that just the act of taking the substance equates to being a guide or offering a substance, right? There's actually a lot more skill than that. But a lot of that skill is invisible. Or, maybe they did it on their own and realized that they were able to get through that. Okay, so why not offer it to others? But so a lot of the skills required aren't as explicit, right, or obvious, right? So just because you had a good trip doesn't mean everybody will have a good trip, and that there's actual assessments people can do to support people's health and safety. Just because only 1 out of 100 people have a crisis doesn't mean it's not going to happen to you, right? Like crises will happen the longer you're in this work, right? So there's just education and training involved that's not always obvious, right? And then there's a certain smaller percentage of folks that we're stepping into, like delusions of grandeur, narcissism, and psychosis, right? And those are the folks that we have to be really careful around, because we don't want folks who are way out of alignment working with these medicines. And I think sometimes these medicines can elicit delusions of grandeur in certain people, small percentage of people, but still enough to be problematic, right? And so the mushrooms telling you to be a guide just isn't enough, right? So I can have a religious experience and God will tell me, hey, you're supposed to be a doctor, or hey, you're supposed to be a lawyer, right? I can have a religious experience, or an accountant, or whatever, right? That doesn't mean I can just skip going to med school or skip going to law school, right? Why do people, there's like a glitch there to assume
Right.
that people can just jump into being a guide without some sort of education,
Mm-hmm.
That works to a certain degree, but it's got to be based in reality too, right? So I think it's a natural impulse that's sometimes misunderstood. The other thing that I'll just say here before I complete this thought is there's a lot of ways to be a guide, and so somebody's inspired to be a guide right after their psychedelic trip might mean something radically different from me, like from what I do as a professional guide, right? Like I can be a guide by being an accountant for a psychedelic program. I can be a guide by like being an advocate in my corporate arena for these tools for healing, right? I don't have to just be a guide. That's not for everybody. I would say, with our clinic and our training program and everything, only a certain percentage of people who choose, are called to be a guide can actually have the skill set and the wherewithal to step right into being a guide. Like this, not everybody can do it, at least right away. Some people need a lot more training than they think they do, right?
Mm. Yeah, I think that last point has been alive to me. It's like oftentimes when I hear that from people, it's almost like they think, oh, this is the easy path. And maybe it's because in the medicine experience, everything did feel so aligned and so easy. And
Mm-hmm.
yet I want to gently remind them, like, well, actually, you're choosing a very challenging path because you're
Yeah,
committing to doing so much of your own work to be
right.
able to like really be present and hold space for people. And, if you continue whatever job that you have before that's not involved in the medicine, you have a little bit more agency in terms of like how much I want to bite off, at a
Yeah,
time, like
yeah,
like I've practiced Tibetan Buddhism for years, and within Tibetan Buddhism there's like there's a practice of doing a 3-year retreat, and in order to do that you have to do this huge amount of preliminary work.
right.
And when I lived in Tibet for a year, and some of the people I lived with, they were teachers, and they were teaching kids throughout the year, and then on their summer vacation they would go and take a couple of months and do a chunk of the
Uh-huh.
preliminary. So it's like they had it spread out. They didn't have to say, I'm just going to
Yeah,
like quit everything I'm doing and go do this 3-year long thing.
right.
And I thought, wow, that's such a brilliant way of doing it. And I don't think that in the West we tend to think of things that way. We think of like,
Mm.
it's got to be all or nothing, it's like got to be
Right.
so extreme,
Right.
and so yeah, I appreciate that you brought that up. And then also, what I loved about your response is just the acknowledgement of everybody else in the infrastructure, and
Mm-hmm.
that you could use
Mm-hmm.
those accounting skill sets or those business skill sets, and or building skill sets. There's so many different
Yeah.
things that you could apply that to really support other people's psychedelic growth and
Right.
their journeys. And um I think it's really important, because one thing that I've noticed, and this is just my own opinion, but that there's a lot of people that are very eager to get involved in this industry that don't necessarily have a lot of business skills.
Oh yeah.
Like they're
Yeah.
starting their own businesses or they're running businesses, and they don't necessarily have like just some solid business skills,
Mm-hmm.
and so to have more people involved that maybe they don't want to be serving the medicine directly, but to be able to support the organization or the cause, the mission in those other ways is going to become more and more critical as things continue to grow.
Yeah. No, for sure. I have a whole team of people who all they do is support our guides, and it's really hard work. They're challenged just as much as the guides are, but like it's not just doing accounts receivable though. It's doing it for a certain cause that's
Right.
deeply meaningful, and it shifts the dynamic of work radically. And the other thing people don't really get as being a guide is like I'm in the experience with my clients every single time. And so like that's like being like tripping on a very ongoing basis even without taking any medicine. And that if you're not ready for that level of transformation, it can crash a system, so that's something people don't realize. There's a big difference between giving shrooms to your buddies on occasion and doing this every week, right? With no
Yeah.
end in sight, right? Like this is the job, right? Like I want to do this for the rest of my life. That is the job. And then the other piece I'll just name is most of our guides aren't doing it full time. The professional guides aren't even doing it full time. So how would you expect to make that big abrupt shift from accounting to guiding without any sort of transition, right? It's just
Right.
too big of a jump. So,
Yeah.
these medicines, they show us the full picture. And then through integration, we have to say, okay, of that, I have to bring it into a linear step by step path as opposed to just trying to eat the whole apple in one bite, right? It's just not going to work very well. So I have to tell my students and stuff like take your time, go slow. You're looking at a multi-year process, but you can start guiding right away. But you got to get like working out. You got to build a psychic resiliency to this work that
Mm.
people think they don't realize they even have to. So it's been really fascinating. It's been a major education, not only for me, but like everybody on our team, just what a human is actually capable of, and a lot of them, we're all introverts. We're all a little different, so like standard business practices are really hard for us. So
Right.
how do we create a system of practitioners that's supporting the practitioners? That's going to be a big area in the movement. So
Yeah.
I like being in group spaces, like collaborative groups, just because I don't have to hold it all anymore.
Mm. Yeah, like you were mentioning earlier, like you're lending somebody else your nervous system. And
Right.
so, that
That takes a
that
toll.
doesn't just
Mm,
right, that doesn't just
mm.
happen without, some preparation, and you're doing your own work. And
You gotta do your own work. Yeah, your
yeah.
own like your Tibetan practice. Creates resiliency for being a psychedelic guide.
What's funny is, so it's, my partner's been a therapist for a long time, and I'm fairly new. I have been doing, breath work and integration coaching for a few years now. And when I had my day job, uh, sometimes she would get out of session, she's been in session all day, and I'm like, I want to talk to her and I want to connect. And she's like, just, I love you, but like, leave me alone. I gotta have time, And in the beginning, I really took that personally, and I didn't understand it. And now I work 3 days a week at a residential treatment center doing breath work and meditation and somatic work with clients there. And there's days when I get home and I'm just like, and she's like, hey, like, I want to connect. And I'm like, I'm all out. Like, I need time to recharge and to, like, I'm all spent. I don't have the capacity to like hold space for anything right now. And so we've had moments where I'm like, I finally get what you were talking about the whole time, and 3 days a week working at this place is enough. Like, I can't, like, I don't want to work there full time. Like 3 days a week is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. So having a secondary job as a guide actually helps you be a guide for most people. My wife and I, we're pretty full time at this point, but even that is split up by like podcast interviews and running the business, So people underestimate the impact that it has on our psyche. And it doesn't mean it's damaging, right? We're not being like, not all, like, we can be vicariously traumatized by working with people with severe trauma, but there's ways to work with that, right? So it doesn't, it's generally deeply meaningful, and it's hard as hell, and it requires recovery time. So this is one of those factors. Like, so as a business, you have to take into account of like the guides and the employees and the bottom line of like, and what you charge people for the services, to take into account this extra needed self-care time that's not generally required in other professional spaces. It's I don't know, like the energy I equate it to is like being a emergency medicine doctor, or like like really high stress, real brief periods of intensity with some spaciousness, but still a big process, right? It's not a normal job, or like a firefighter or a paramedic or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That, to me, that's what more being a guide is more equivalent to, right?
We got to get our guides some fire poles to slide down before ceremony.
Yeah, right. That would be fun. That would be perfect. Slide. It was like like in that movie, Pulp, or what was it, Fight Club or whatever, where the guy sees the penguin and tells him to slide.
Slide. Yeah, totally.
Be a good way to make an entrance,
right? Yeah, a good sort of like mental cue. Also, it's like, all right, going down my guide slide.
It's like you're holding on and letting go at the same time. It's a good analogy. It's a good analogy.
I love it. Yeah, the guide slide. I wanted to maybe shift gears just a little bit and talk a little bit about combining breath work and cannabis, and maybe what needs to be tweaked there as opposed to just working with the psychedelic cannabis.
Or just the cannabis, or just the breath.
Yeah.
Are you trained in holotropic breath work or another modality?
A neurodynamic breath work, which is kind of a child of holotropic breath work.
Got it.
Yeah. And a lot of the principles are the same in terms of what we studied. And one primary difference is, especially compared to like holotropic style breath work, is you just don't have to breathe as hard, right? And so like requiring the breath can be a little softer. And so instead of like staying with it for 45 minutes straight, sometimes people kind of like drift off in these other realities because of the cannabis. And then the invitation is to just return to the breathing practice when they become aware that they're not doing it anymore, So I've learned that there's a level of like a little bit softerness, gentleness, and more of a little spaciousness, because you're not just depending on the breath. You've got this ally with it too. So that's the primary difference, and just everything gets amplified. It seems cannabis seems to both amplify tetany to some degree, but also
soften it paradoxically. It's like it makes it more manageable, but it can definitely be activated with the cannabis. And I think there's something phenomenally like around like breath work might be inducing endogenous DMT states. I think cannabis is very similar to DMT, so there's something like synergistic with breath and cannabis in these spaces. Um, so I really it took me a while to get comfortable working with cannabis and breath work. But in my sessions, I'm regularly doing it on the second day now. So we'll do a regular cannabis session on the first day. And then on the second day, we'll do like we call a cannabis-assisted breathwork session. And it just blows like everything. It's like a blowing energy through a pressurized hose that's kind of stuck and kinked out. It just blows everything out of the system. And especially if I've found it really useful if people are getting stuck in their head or looping through mental constructs. Right, you can't think your way out of mental constructs. It's like a paradox, right? Like you just fall into that hole even more. So
don't think of the pink elephant.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So breath work helps you step out of that mental space. Just stay with the breath. Don't try to figure anything out. And the cannabis and the breath work will really just help people like break through into those like non-thought, non-thinking pink elephant spaces, right? So so I have a real I love it. And it took me a couple of years to say it's not just breath work while adding cannabis. There's a synergy there that you can learn through experience. So if I were you experimenting adding breath or cannabis to your breathwork practice, I would just say it's okay to lighten on the breath. Like you have an extra ally that's rowing that boat with you. And that if somebody loses the breath, then they'll just remind them to gently return to it when they realize they're not breathing. And it's very akin to like a fast DMT level experience. Maybe even an extended state DMT experience. It can be hyper visual, hypersomatic. People like shake and flop all over the place. It can get really loud. People can, like in a regular breathwork, people can yell and holler and scream or cry or laugh and all of that. They're really fun. Cannabis breathwork groups are really fun. They can get very rambunctious. Also, it's just safe. Everybody stays very safe. Whereas like psilocybin, somebody might really struggle to stay on their mat, but cannabis breathwork folks, they're able to stay on their mat and stay with the experience, even if they're flying through the cosmos and dissolving their egos.
Nice. And where would you sort of advise people that breathwork, like how to fit a breathwork practice into preparation or integration? Is it something that you sort of have a protocol with, or as far as like maybe sequencing, like maybe somebody that's interested in doing deeper psychedelic work, could breathwork fit into sort of a preparation and integration protocol?
Yeah, sure. Just regular breathwork without cannabis, but also just cannabis and also cannabis-assisted breathwork. All of these could be preparation and integration. And so what we were talking about, like cannabis or breathwork as a stepping stone to bigger medicines. One, you retain your agency, but you still have a full altered state experience. So it's a wonderful get to know this space before I fully commit. And then the other piece is oftentimes things that are held in the body or in the psyche as like a defense mechanism that can be softened pretty substantially with the breathwork or cannabis. And so it's not as triggering or as hard in the big medicine experience, right? And it can also help form your intention for the big medicine experience. It's like just give you greater insight of what you want to work on with the big medicine journey. And on the post side of it, the integration side of it is, man, like sometimes with that big psilocybin journey or ayahuasca retreat or whatever, it's like you got through most of it, but there's still that 10% that's still hanging on, that's holding on. And the idea of having to do a whole other psilocybin journey is just too much. Like people are tired, they're worn out, but they're still a little incomplete, right? Like they're a little frayed at the edges. Let me get in the screen. Their psyche is just a little frayed at the edges. So what we can do with like a integration cannabis journey is return, like what it does is it re-elicits that psilocybin or the ayahuasca state with cannabis. And it's just a 2 or 3 hour journey versus a all night journey. And something about that completion, that it helps resolve and clear up that last 10% without that big like time and energy commitment of another medicine. So I found, and this is something that we see regularly in our clinic too, is somebody who has had a lot of big experiences. They come into our to work with cannabis, and it's just like, it's all just like right there. And they have like a breakthrough pretty quickly because they just never completed their process. So it's an incredible, both breath work, just regular breath work. Like imagine you just breathing it out. You just, every exhale, you're just breathing it out, tying up those loose ends. But it can be done with cannabis or cannabis breath work.
Yeah. Sounds like sometimes they're just primed for that last little bit of release and processing.
And it just took all the time of the psilocybin to get to that point, right? And they're just primed for it. Cannabis, something about cannabis is like, because of that sense of safety and that agency, if somebody's primed for the work, they'll just pop right into it. It's really amazing to witness and hold space for.
Nice. So, the name of the show is The Vital Point. And I like to say like my vital point, although there are sort of many vital points that come up, but my vital point is like, regardless of the methods that you're practicing, the most important thing is that you have to practice it. Is there something that's alive for you at the moment, or sort of relative in the current space that you're in terms of like, what would be the vital point that you're imparting to people that you're working with, or maybe that's alive in your life in terms of your own work and growth?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, man, that's such a big question. I love it. For me, like I'm always attempting to stay right on that edge of development and growth, always nudging myself forward, but without overwhelming myself. Like I hold the big picture, but I'm always like, my vital point is like, what's next? What's right here? What's in the present moment? I'm always attempting to return to the present moment. Even though, we have such a big program and such a big mission. And I found that for me, it's what keeps me sane. And it keeps me self-regulated to only hold what I'm working with in the moment, as opposed to trying to hold that big piece. I'll always remember it, but I'm constantly choosing to let it go. And also for me, it's a growth edge. Obviously, as things get more complex, there's always like significant ethical questions. We want to work in integrity, and do well, right? We want to keep people safe and be aware of our own dynamics and our own subconscious behavior, so that we can always be fully present for others. And so that's, for me, is like an ongoing exploration of self. And then from that place of self, I do my best to offer of service, of support for others. So that's what comes up for me as you ask that really complex question. I'll probably have a different answer every time you would ask it.
Yeah, sometimes that's how it goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I really appreciate you sharing. And I had this visual as you were talking about, just like there's the point, but maybe like on a sword or a knife, like there's the point, but then there's that edge, and being able to walk the edge, as well as connecting to the point. Well, I would definitely say that for those listening or watching this podcast, I can highly recommend this book, Psychedelic Cannabis. It's been super informative for me, like with my interests and my work, but also I think that there's a lot in here that is applicable to just psychedelic work in general. If you're, especially if you're new to this type of stuff. And, you maybe when we're talking about preparation or integration, you're like, well, what is that? One of the things that I liked the most in the book, and I've adopted it in my own way, is, that you mentioned not only set and setting, but the skills that you bring in, because the skills can change your set and setting. They can really have an impact to your experience. So, things incorporating things like mindfulness and somatic awareness and, all the things that can really help to modify the benefit that you're getting from these medicines in a really positive way. So just really appreciate this book, and appreciate your time being here. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what sort of offerings you guys have right now, or if people are interested in getting more involved or working with you, how and what would that look like?
Well, first of all, thanks for reading my book. That means a lot to me. And I wanted to share what we were learning, but also, like you said, provide just good foundational skills for psychedelic journey work in general. And so that's cannabis is a part of a umbrella of beautiful medicines that we can work with. And so we have a center here, a Center for Medicinal Mindfulness. It's a working psychedelic therapy center, and you can learn more about that at medicinalmindfulness.org. We host people from all over the country pretty regularly, come flying in for week-long retreats. And then I have a program called Psychedelic Sitters School, psychedelicsitterschool.org. And we're training people how to work not only with cannabis, but also ketamine. And with the new laws here in Colorado, we're stepping into working and teaching with psilocybin mushrooms and also DMT. So we have a very holistic, broad training program. And then if you want to learn about other programs, dmtx.org, that's another program that we haven't really talked about, but very interesting for those of you curious about working with DMT. So that's how I would connect. We do online and in-person conscious cannabis circles monthly. So wherever you are in the world, as long as you have an internet connection, you can join one of our conscious cannabis circles. And that's like, if you don't believe me, cannabis isn't a psychedelic, but you're curious enough or open enough to at least just give it a try, that would be the best container to do that in. And we tell you how to get, what medicines to get, and guide you through the whole process, even online. So those are fun ways to connect with us.
Nice. Yeah. I'm going to check one of those out. I sort of made a conscious decision that I wanted to go deeper with the cannabis and the breath work. And I have my fingers crossed that we'll be able to do like a part 2 at some point and talk about the DMTX project, because there's definitely really intriguing stuff there. And, but I was like, breath work and cannabis are so important to me. And I just, I had to make I just had to make a choice.
No, I get it. Yeah, no, I get it. Me too. Cannabis is like, as an advocate for cannabis, it's undervalued. And to me, working with all the medicines, it truly is, especially combined with breath work, it's the most healing of all the medicines. I really believe that. And it has an important place. So I'm really grateful that you didn't just get interested in the shiny object of DMTX, but this is the working medicine. This is the one that's going to really help, millions of people as quickly as possible. So it's important. Yeah, it's good, important.
Yeah. Well, for those that have been listening or watching, can't recommend that book enough. And Daniel's other programs, definitely check them out. And, whatever the work that you're doing, just remember to keep practicing it. Right. That's the vital point.
Keep going.
Keep going. Stay with it. Stay with those challenges as well as the high points. It's all part of the journey. And these medicines are there to help support you through that. So just keep practicing. That's the vital point. I sincerely hope you found value and inspiration in this episode. If it struck a chord with you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could just take a moment to leave a review. It's a simple, cost-free way to show support and help more like-minded people discover the show. Also, make sure you sign up for my newsletter at bluemagicalchemy.com to be the first to get updates, exclusive content, and insights delivered straight to your inbox. It's a fantastic way to stay connected and keep the learning journey going. When you sign up, I'll send a free guide to using breathwork for integration as a way to show my gratitude for your support. If you're ready to dive deeper and begin working together, I encourage you to reach out to me through my website or one of my social media platforms. I am Blue Magic Alchemy, basically anywhere you can find me on the internet, most of the major social media networks. And I'm happy to set up a discovery call to learn more about how I can support you in your integration journey and exploration. Remember, it's not about the method you choose or the pace at which you travel. The vital point is to consistently show up for yourself and practice. It's not the destination, but the journey that truly matters. And I'm honored to accompany you on yours. So please don't hesitate to reach out, connect, share your journey, the successes and challenges alike. I'm just an email, DM, or review away. Let's journey, grow, and transform together. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until the next episode, keep exploring, keep growing, and above all, keep practicing, because that's the vital point.